everybody, and welcome to BMAD Spotlight. And with us today, we have Jack Wang from Longhorn Financials. We're glad to have you here with us. And Jack, I'm going to introduce you now. Welcome to the program, BMAD Spotlight.
Hey, Mike, thanks so much for having me on. I really appreciate being a guest on the program.
Oh, great to have you here, Jack. So tell us a little bit about who Jack Wang is, where you're from, and a little bit of your history so the audience knows who we're talking to today.
Yeah, so again, my name is Jack Wang. I am CEO of Longhorn Financial, which is my own financial services practice. And I actually live in Westford. My wife and I are from this area, so I'm a little bit of ways away from Quincy, although Quincy is a great town. South Shore is a great place. Yeah, I've been self-employed for a little bit more than 10 years. I love it. Started out my career in banking originally with actually an employer down in Quincy in the Marina Bay area. It was actually my first job out of college. So I used to drive from Chelmsford, which is, if you don't know, is right, 10 minutes from the New Hampshire border through Boston, right, pre-Zachem Bridge to Quincy.
That's a bad commute today. I wouldn't want to do that today.
Yeah, it's still bad today. It was bad then. It's bad today. But did that for a number of years. Really enjoyed it. Actually, the banking thing, not necessarily driving down to Quincy. Spent some time in the corporate world, but then eventually had to make the change, go out on my own, and haven't looked back since. Love it. Love helping people. Love being on my own.
That's great, Jack. So before we get into the meat and potatoes of it, tell us a little bit about, how you're doing during this pandemic time, this unprecedented moment in history. What are you up to? Has this challenged you or accelerated you? What's happened?
Yeah, so during this time of pandemic, it really has changed. Not so much for me, but for my clients. And so I know we'll get into this a little bit, but really my focus is primarily on helping families navigate the college financial aid process. So maximizing aid, finding the right colleges, getting scholarships, all the way through filling out financial aid forms, figuring out how to actually pay the bill, and then ultimately how to do so in a way so that people are still able to retire. So as a self-employed individual, I'm used to working from home primarily. So Zoom calls and things like that aren't anything new to me. That's not the difference. The difference is actually my wife is a school teacher, so she's having to teach from home. And so we're competing for space in the house, and sometimes she can hear me in the background, or I can hear her when I'm doing my Zoom calls, dogs and cats getting in the way. But as far as my clients, of course, during this time, it was really, it was very scary. I mean, it still is. So, it could be that two parents had jobs and they were going to send their son or daughter off to school, for some costs. And when both parents are working, it wasn't that big of a deal. But now both parents are out of work. Well, that is a big deal now, right? Because even a small tuition bill is still a bill. So it's been very, very hectic, helping families figure that out, figure out the retirement piece, when people, just lost 30% of their 401k in the blink of an eye, basically. So, as far as the delivery of the services, not any different, but just the urgency and sort of that fight or flight response, of course, has been a change. So, but I love to help people, and on Zoom calls all day. I was used to that anyway, so it's not that big of a deal for me, I guess.
Well, that's good to know. It's good to know a little bit more about your journey here. So you're doing financial aid, which definitely makes a big difference in people's financial lives. College and postgraduate school, very expensive. A lot of people need help. Need money. So there's a lot of misconceptions about financial aid, a lot of categories and things. Why don't you explain a little bit about that, educate us a little bit about financial aid, Jack?
When you talk about making a difference, I mean, financial aid and college is one of, if not the biggest, expense for a family in their working years, right? And it obviously depends on where your kid goes to school and things like that. But in some cases, it's more expensive, can be more expensive than the house you might live in. And I sometimes work with clients and I tell them sort of half jokingly, hey, you know what, you're actually, if you want to forget this college thing, you're actually better off buying your kid a Ferrari because it's actually cheaper. Um, that can be the case. So anyway, so with regard to financial aid, there's really two broad categories, right? So there's the merit aid, which is the scholarships and things, and merit aid is based on your, the grades, the test scores, athletic or artistic ability, things like that. And then there's a need-based aid, which is really based on the finances. How much you make, how much you have in the bank, things like that. And so some of the misconceptions really are things like, well, I make too much money to qualify for aid. And that's just simply not true. It's really understanding how the game works and how, these two broad categories and what the rules and what schools actually look for and what actually counts or doesn't count. It's really understanding those things to really allows family to maximize aid. So there's really no such thing as I make too much money to qualify for aid. You can still get it, again, if you know the rules of the game.
So what should families know, Jack? Tell us a little bit about, what families need to look at when they're trying to get their child or their student financial aid.
Yeah, so I'll start on the merit aid side. This is probably one that most families really go for. And that is, you have to remember, so if you are a football fan or any kind of sports fan, I suppose, the National Football League recently just held their annual draft, right? And it goes in rounds. And so the top players go in the first round, right? The most desired players at whatever position, they get the biggest money. And then you go each successive round. And as you go further into the draft, all the way culminating in the seventh round, yeah, you got drafted, but the amount of money you get is far, far less. Well, colleges essentially work the same way for students, right? So parents look at, well, my kid got however much on the SAT, and my kid is a GPA of whatever, and that's all good, right? And that's not to minimize their hard work. That's really good. But at the end of the day, when you apply to college, you are essentially judged or ranked, however you want to say it, against all of the other applicants. And so just by way of reference, so even if your son or daughter was the valedictorian at their high school, which is a great achievement, you have to remember that there are 30,000 high schools in the United States, which means that there are 30,000 valedictorians in the United States every year. So if your valedictorian, as an example, applies to the college where all the other valedictorians apply each year, then even though your kid was valedictorian, but in the context of the college, you're just average, right? I hate to say it that way, but it's actually true. So merit aid really is a function of how schools, right, assuming to give out merit aid, how schools rank your students against all the other applicants. The higher they rank, for whatever reason they do, they're going to get more money. The lower they rank, they're going to get less money or none at all, right? And that's really independent of how much mom and dad make for money or, whether you have the big house or whatever. This is purely on the merits of the students themselves. And that's something that parents don't really think about because they just think, well, my kid got 1,500 SAT, they're awesome. Yeah, that is awesome, but not necessarily in context of the applicant pool at that particular school.
So, Jack, what are some things that parents and students should do and maybe shouldn't do as they're planning and getting ready to apply for financial aid?
Yeah, again, it's really understanding the rules and understanding the time frame. So, for example, on the need-based side, right, where income and assets actually do count, the income counts in what's known as the base year. And so we as parents think about years as academic years, right? So like September to June-ish. But financial aid runs like a calendar year because it's primarily based off of a tax return. So the calendar year that spans spring of sophomore year, into the summer, and into the fall of junior year, right? That calendar year, spring of sophomore year into the fall of junior year, that calendar year is the year that counts for financial aid. So that year is the year you want to look poor on paper. Not all, easier said than done, but that's the ideal. So if you get a bonus at work, if you were to take on one-time income items, like sell a bunch of stock because you're trying to pay for a kitchen renovation or something, that's the year that you do not want to do those things, because every bit of extra income that you get in that particular calendar year is going to simply cost you in aid potential, right? Which is separate than merit aid, right? We talked about that, but the financial need-based aid, that's the year that counts. So you want to be very careful about that.
So when should people start planning, for saving for college? And when do you typically see people actually do it? So what's the ideal, and when do people actually start to do it?
Yeah, in an ideal, of course, the ideal sense is that you start saving as soon as your kid's born, right? But quite frankly, very few people, I should say, do that, because you're busy with diapers and formula and getting enough sleep, and it's just not on people's radar. In an ideal sense, really, when you really start planning for it, I don't mean saving, right? You can't save early enough, but really kind of going into the nuts and bolts of this really should be like end of junior high, beginning of high school. The reality is most of my clients come to me sophomore year to junior year, maybe beginning of senior year, with the understanding that the further ahead you start this, the more options you have. If you come to me at the start of your senior year, it's not that I can't help, it's just my hands are tied for certain things, fewer options. And then, of course, I get phone calls from parents, Mike, who, they're a month away, right? This time of year, they're a month away from getting the college bill. Hey, listen, Jack, I'm going to be looking at an $80,000 bill that's going to be due next month. What do I do? There's very little I can try and help someone. Offer ideas, but if you come to me at that late hour, my hands are completely tied, so are yours, right? So it's probably no difference with you, Mike, doing video. Like, hey, Mike, I need a video by tomorrow with this, this, and this. You may or may not be able to deliver depending on what it is that they need, right? So, the further ahead you plan this, the better off. But it's really ideally end of junior high, beginning of high school would be the ideal. That's when you tend to have the most options.
So what can people, families, once they've talked to you and say initially, what can they talk about amongst themselves, to start building and planning for this, to make it a little bit easier and smoother a journey, to financial aid and through it?
A lot of this process is really setting expectations, right? The students hear one thing, they have one thing in mind, and they're hearing it from their guidance counselors and their peers and whoever else. And then there are the parents. And so one of the things I tell families to really think about are three numbers. Okay? One is what's called the expected family contribution, which is what the colleges, based on your financials, based on your financial aid forms, is what the colleges figure you can afford to pay for school. Okay, that's number one. Now, whether you can actually afford it or not is a different story. That's number one. Number two is what can you actually afford to pay, which usually is a far different number, right? And then the third number is what are you actually willing to pay, right? And so I'll give you just very quickly just two extreme examples. So I know two families. One family is, parents make decent money, but they have a couple of kids at home. And so what the colleges figure they can afford to pay is actually kind of high. What they're willing to pay, however, what they truly can afford to pay is actually, they do a good job with their finances, is actually up there too. But what they're willing to pay for each kid is relatively low because they recognize that they have multiple children they're going to have to put through this process, right? So they don't want to blow all their money on the first kid and leave nothing for the second or the third. Now, on the flip side, the payment mechanisms that parents have with loans and everything really allow for this situation. So I know a family where mom and dad make huge income. So what the colleges expect them to be able to afford to pay is really, really high. It's way up here. What they can actually afford to pay is almost nothing, because this particular family I'm thinking of, they spend like drunken sailors. Okay, so they make huge money, have nothing in savings, nothing set aside, comes in, goes right out. But what are they willing to pay? So in their case, their particular student was accepted at a well-known private university, but no aid. But the parents were willing to borrow the $75,000 a year it took to get their kid to the school. So even though that they really could not afford anything, they were really willing to take that on at the risk of their own futures to get their kid to the school. I will tell you, Mike, that very few families have this conversation. Even towards the end, like the kids like got into school, ready to send the deposit, whole 9 yards, and it just sets up for a lot of hurt feelings and a lot of crying when, or panic attacks on the part of the parents who realize, oh my goodness, I really can't afford this, right? Like I've been telling my kid all along, oh yeah, do this, do this, do this. Now I get the, staring down the barrel of an $80,000 bill, and the parents flip out because it's $80,000. So having that conversation first is huge as part of this process, just so everybody can be on the same page and nobody's gonna be crying later and no panic attacks and nobody's gonna be running for, I don't know, Xanax or antidepressant pills or something. Right? You gotta get these things out of the way first.
Well, this whole situation, I'm sure, plays into it now. People are, not even sure how college is going to work anymore. They're going to be doing a lot of things online, as opposed to going, to dormitories and apartments, and that may change the financial costs and things too. So have you had any questions about that, or any advice, for people going forward, what they can expect or what they should plan, based on what we're seeing now?
Yeah, lots of questions on that, because there's so much uncertainty. And every family is different. I mean, I hear stories about, they're still going to send their kid to college, but maybe to school a lot closer because God forbid something similar happens again. Hey, I want to be able to hop in the car, drive an hour, get my kid, and bring him home if I need to, right? But some families are still sending their kids across the country, so it really varies. And so it's really, this whole pandemic has really kind of forced a conversation on sort of what does going away to college actually mean, and what's actually important, right? Is it the name of the school? Is it the campus environment? Is it the academics, or whatever? And so it's created so much uncertainty. What I will tell you is this, and I'm seeing, and you have these sort of top tier schools with the big endowments. I don't necessarily even mean Ivy Leagues, but near Ivy League class. They tend not to give out a lot of merit-based aid, right? Because they're so competitive to get in. And so I've run into a number of situations where the parents have, as clients, the parents have lost their jobs, but the kids got into these schools. And so it would make for a very easy, what they call appeal, like, hey, mom and dad lost their job. Can you give us a little bit more aid? Because we really can't afford this number. And I got to tell you, a number of these schools have said, no, we're not going to consider giving you more money because we think it's, not in a mean way, but we think it might be temporary. But the reality is a lot of these schools get so many applications from families who can just pay. So it's really, hey kid, if you can't pay, unfortunately the message sometimes is kind of get out of line and we'll talk to the family in line behind you who can pay, right? And so there's one school in particular that I helped a client with, that was basically their message. And I was shocked that it came back that way, that, we'll talk to you in a year and we'll consider it then. But it meant that their son had to go to freshman year, pay basically full price, and then be able to ask. And even then they might've said no. Which, if you're out of work today, right, because of the pandemic, at least in my mind, you can't take that kind of risk. So again, I was very shocked. Schools are generally willing to consider it, but it's just this one school that's highly competitive, just below Ivy League. I was really surprised at that answer, that they just were saying, nah, we're not even going to think about it. We're not going to help you out. I was shocked.
So that's a lot to think about, Jack. There's a lot of people out there with, kids that are thinking about going to school, and with the changing world that we're in, may or may not get there. But it really boils down to money more than anything for a lot of folks. So any last suggestions or recommendations you can give, to people, things they can do to make the journey a little bit easier and maybe find some success?
Yeah, I will tell you that college, both the financial aid side, which is what I do, and the admission side, are really games that parents and students play, but they go into playing that game without knowing any of the rules, right? So at least when we watch professional sports, Patriots, Red Sox, Bruins, whatever, you count on both teams understanding the rules, and you have umpires or refs to sort of enforce them. Everybody's sort of working on the same playing field. But when it comes to college admissions and college financial aid, you're playing against the admissions officer, playing against the financial aid officer. And of course, they're not going to tell you the rules, right? Right? That's like expecting the blackjack dealer to tell you, like how to count cards, right? That's just not going to happen. So these financial aid officers and admissions officers, they're not incented to share these things with you. So you have to play these very complicated games without knowing the rules. And so it's very difficult to navigate the system. So as a long-winded last tip, get some help, right? Whether it's from me or anybody else, but get some help because it is that complicated.
Jack, you truly are impacting people's lives with what you do. It's a big time in a student's life and a huge financial burden for a lot of families trying to get their kids, that higher education that they know they need to, compete in this, global economy. So I applaud you for what you do. And why don't you tell us, how the audience can get a hold of you if they'd like to talk to you?
Yeah, people can always reach me via email, jack@Longhorn, FIN, short for Longhorn Financial, but longhornfin.com, or they can go to my website at longhornfin.com.
That's great, Jack. I truly do appreciate, you coming on with us today. It's an important topic, and it's important to a lot of people. So, thank you for being with us here on BMAD Spotlight. And, we'll be doing some more of these as we go along, Jack. I hope we can get you back again in the future. So thanks for coming on today.
Thank you so much, Mike. I really appreciate it. It's great. My pleasure being here.
All right. And thank you for tuning in. See you on the next BMAD Spotlight.